Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this installment of International Marketing, Chapter 8. So, as you recall, we last Chapter 7, we went over finding global customers. So now we're going to the next step, which is once you find those customers, how to analyze people and markets. So this chapter, we're going to split in 3 parts, and I'll try to keep it succinct, hopefully 1 hour or less. I did split up the chapter in 3 parts, so I do encourage you to take breaks and maybe just kind of think after you've completed each section what you've learned, and make sure you go over your notes. All right, so here we go. It's the objectives for this chapter. We're looking at developing an understanding of the importance and necessity of research itself. We're going to compare and contrast domestic and international research. A lot of businesses here tend to just kind of sometimes wing it, and they think if it's good enough for us, it'll be good enough somewhere else, and of course that backfires. We're going to learn how to obtain research objectives through secondary information. So for those of you who remember your secondary and primary information, just to kind of jog your memory in case you don't remember how that works. The secondary information is information for research that you're getting from just a secondary source. So it could be from the government, the census, something like that. The primary is way more expensive, but more accurate. That's information for data that you're sourcing yourself. So we'll look at that. And there we go, the primary sources here. Let's see, so now defining the issue for this chapter. So the AMA, the American Marketing Association, defines market research as the function that links the consumer, customer, and public to marketers through information. So that's kind of a really kind of a broad definition, but it's the one from the AMA that defines the issue of what marketing is. So in this case, we're looking at information. Notice through information. So information is used to identify marketing opportunities and problems. So think when I see opportunities, I always think right away, oh, this is probably about the SWOT analysis. So with the SWOT analysis, you're looking at strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, right? And if you look at the word problem itself for the detailed, complete SWOT analysis, it's when usually defined as an external, uncontrollable threat attacking your internal controllable weakness. So that's in this case, we're going to try to connect the dots and try to see how your internal strength can help leverage those opportunities outside the US in this case. So then the information is used to generate, refine, and evaluate marketing action. You are going to also let me go back. Information is used to also monitor marketing performance. It's used to improve understanding of a marketing as a process. And now we're going to start with our very first part. And so this is just kind of like a quick little table of content of what part 1 is going to be for us. We're going to look at international and domestic research, recognize the need for research. Again, think about, you'd be surprised how many multinationals just kind of wing it. And the benefit of research and the research objectives. So starting with international and domestic research, there are 4 key differences here. There's new parameters in this case for international, right? The parameters are going to be completely different. What are some of those parameters? Well, there could be duties, right? So think about what you've learned in global business. And so think about trade barriers, right? So there could be duties. The currency itself can be a primary difference that can be of impact depending where you're going, depending on fluctuations. The mode of transportation. Some countries, the infrastructure is not going to be lending itself well, maybe to the kind of distribution you need to rely on for your product. International documentations. Remember that also documentation can be a vehicle for trade barrier, right? So they're called administrative delays, if you remember that from global. Administrative delay is a way to, kind of make things a little bit more difficult if you're trying to erect trade barriers. So consider that international documentation might not always be, the process of procurement for international documentation might change over time depending on policies. The port facilities, I'll show you a picture in this presentation of a port in China that's completely automated. Hong Kong is in the process of finalizing its completely automated port as well. So if when you're looking at different countries in terms of port facilities, what works, what doesn't, in terms of trade, it's going to affect cost. That's one thing to consider. So the new environment, which involves understanding, in this case, the culture of the host country and its demographics. So if I were to ask you, what country in the world do you think has a demographic? In this case, if you want to think about that country and its people as a target market for American multinationals, what country is most similar to the US demographically? So think about that for a second. If your answer was Canada, then you're correct. A lot of times people think, oh, it's got to be England, but it's actually Canada. By the way, our best friend in the whole world is Canada. What do I mean by that? It's the country that buys the most from the US than any other country in the world. So the culture and its demographic. The political system. So if I have something in red, it's because I'm kind of, I want to show you what I've attached that connects with that. So this is a world risk map. Several different organizations have them. Control risks is a big one. They do risk maps and risk assessment analysis for multinationals for all kinds of companies throughout the world. This one happens to be from Alliance. So in this particular risk map, you can see, of course, green is good and red is bad. So if you're thinking about going to those countries, it doesn't mean you can't go, but it just means you have to make sure that you account for a risk assessment so that you know what you're getting into. Let's see, stability. So I put that in red as well because that's what we're talking about, right? Stability and political systems. If you look, I don't know, Argentina is unfortunately still having some pretty significant economic issues. I believe there's another IMF bailout that just was in the works recently, and so that's probably why in this particular case, among other things, political system is going to be red there. Let's see, the difference in societal structure and language obviously is going to be a factor. Legal issues. Different laws in different parts of the world, technological level of the society. So this is where you can use things like the CIA World Factbook and look at different countries, and you're going to see a lot of interesting data there about access to the internet, about bandwidth and things like that. And then of course the economic environment. So for those of you who remember the SWOT, think about the external uncontrollable environment here. Legal, political, social, global, economic, competitive, etc. So international and domestic research. So numbers of factors are the number of changing dimensions that increase geometrically and the interaction between them. Of course, we're talking about the world, so that's going to be a huge factor. Coordination becomes very difficult. In this case, what I have for you is China's manufacturing exodus. In this particular case, we're seeing that because of ensuing trade wars between China and the U.S., one of the ways that China has been able to kind of hedge its bet, it's also by relocating some of the manufacturing outside of China, and so it's again, Southeast Asia is a big area, and India has really gotten a lot of business from, in this case, from China. So this is one of those examples, right, of foreign direct investment, if you want to kind of recall that from your previous class. And a broader definition of competition is faced when entering the international market. So what is competition? I always kind of like to use an example of usually kind of helps people think of competition a different way. If I were to tell you that you have been tasked with helping, I don't know, Delta Airline identify its competitors with flights from California, Los Angeles Airport, LAX, going to, in this case, we'll say Buenos Aires, since we talked about Argentina. So let's just say it's a direct flight, right? And you're asking to look at competition. So what people will do right away is kind of think about Delta's direct competition. So they'll give me a list of a bunch of other airlines that compete with Delta, United, American, stuff like that. But what if in this case I were to ask you, well, maybe think about the client for a second, and the client is a company, and this particular service here is for its business people to meet their contact. So, we're talking maybe the business class or people traveling that way. Well, would you say Zoom is a competitor? Of course it is. So there's more than one way, right? And so think about something like that. Think about video conferencing of any means as a competitor, a direct competitor to that airline industry. In fact, in the US, it's really been one of the biggest loss in profits for many American airline companies, because they benefited before by having these kind of very reliable business deals with big corporations who would use an airline exclusively for its business class. So all of its executives would always fly with the same airline. So that's an example in this case of a substitute product or indirect competition. So we're looking at the breadth of the competition to track the competitive activities and evaluate the actual and potential impacts on its own operation. Again, aligned with the previous slide here, this is an article from the Carnegie Endowment asking, is Vietnam eating into China's share of manufacturing? Vietnam is one of those preferred destinations for Chinese manufacturing that wants to relocate outside of China. Let's see. So recognizing the need for search. So you look at that picture here, there's a lot of fear, right? Why we do things. Sometimes we don't do things out of fear. So entering a market without conducting market research places firms, their assets, and their entire operation at risk. So you might ask yourself, why would you not do that? Why would you not want to research, right? So firms are reluctant to engage in international marketing activities due to lack of sensitivity to difference in consumer tastes and preference. Again, this is kind of a little bit of I see it as a little bit of a ethnocentricity, right? Ethnocentric behavior, where my way is the best way, and if it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. So you have to definitely, watch that. And then, of course, limited appreciation for different marketing environments abroad is another one. Let's see. So recognizing the need for research, lack of familiarity with national and international data source, and the inability to use them. Firms building up their international marketing activities on the basis of unsolicited order. I have a phone there because if you think about this graphic, a lot of companies started their footprint that way, their international footprint that way. It started kind of as a reaction to a need, because they literally got a phone call from outside the US. Someone overseas called them. When I worked in the computer industry, I was in government sales. I sold computers and system solution to the government, CMAS and GSA accounts. Those are state government accounts and federal accounts. And because of my ability to speak French, I was on the operator's list in case somebody called in French. So I got a call from this guy, unsolicited call out of Tahiti, who had a company, and he was tired of buying very expensive computers from France that were computers that were coming from the US. So this guy's in Tahiti, and his computers were so expensive because they were shipped, they were compact computers, a lot of them, and so they were shipping compact computers, directly to Europe and then back to Tahiti. And so that's why you always want to make sure that it's better to be proactive, but there's nothing wrong with starting your international process based on, the unsolicited orders. Let's see, moving on. International marketing research is important because it permits management to identify and develop strategies for internationalization. Again, you don't want to, you can be reactionary, you can be reactive, and you can try to wing it. But if you are able to sit down and get some help and really have the right resources, then you can have a sound strategy to internationalize. And of course, remember that the best plans have to be flexible and adaptable to change. So you want to be very flexible with your strategy. You don't want to be too rigid. All right, recognizing the need for research. So maybe you remember those 4 Ps. Let's see if you can think in your head about what the 4 Ps are again, the marketing mix. But it helps to develop a marketing plan. It determines the appropriate marketing mix, there it is, for each international market, and provides management with foreign market intelligence. So again, that's one of the key needs there. What is the benefit of research? Well, I wonder if we could come up with a formula for this. Yes, we can. The value of research is making a particular decision, may be determined by applying this equation. So what we have here is the value of the decision with the benefit of research minus the value of the decision without the benefit of research. And when you kind of think about this calculation, that should be greater than the cost of research, right? If it's not, well, maybe then you don't need that research, right? And so just, again, something to consider. Determining a research objective. So the research objective vary from firm to firm due to the views of management, the corporate mission of the company. Again, if you have like very narrow product line, you don't have a very broad product line, and you have a very specific mission. Again, maybe that some markets are just not going to work for you. What's the marketing situation? Then information needs are linked closely with the level of international expertise in the firm. And as we just identified, a lot of firms lack that. So going international, exporting. So now we know to do that, to export, which, by the way, remember from your global business class, is the first step to going global is exporting, right? That's the first step. Now, the exception to that, if you remember, are the born global companies. If you're born global, then you don't need to use exporting as your first step. So the foreign market opportunity analysis is the most frequent objective of the international market research. So I just kind of like give you a little bit of an example here of what that looks like, right? Is it profitable for us to go there? Can the benefit convince the target market in this case? Can the target markets be reached with cost-effective media and trade channels? Are benefits better than competitors in our case? Think about your VRIO, think about all your strategic tools here and apply them in this case to this market. Do we have the resources to deliver the benefits? So those are just kind of key questions for you to think about there. The broad brush approach to narrow down international marketing activities. There are 2 approaches, being country ranking and clustering. So if you remember, there's different ways of trying to cluster countries, right? And there's so many different ways. If you just remember the cluster approach being one of them. Again, exporting, the approach should begin with a cursory analysis of the general markets, such as per capita GDP and the GDP growth, right? So the GDP, the per capita GDP, or GDP growth, what are the mortality rates? Mortality rates at birth, maternal birth mortality rates. What's the population? And so here I give you an example here of Panama. And Panama is really kind of hot right now. So 2021, the GDP is not that big, $126 billion. So this is not a $1 trillion economy like Mexico, for example, right? So Panama, in relations to Mexico, for example, very, very, very small economy. but the per capita GDPs, so again, $29,000 per person, so just think about that. The GDP growth, that's the part right there. Look at that, 15%. I mean, when the US has a GDP growth of 3%, we celebrate. This is massive, massive GDP growth. The maternal mortality rate, 50 deaths for 100,000 live births here, and the population is at 4 billion. So, again, I think that's less than LA County. But, you're thinking about the product, you're thinking about the market, you're thinking about, is there a space there for me? And when you see a GDP growth that's 15%, that's gonna give you pause maybe. The CIA World Factbook, here's what I used. If you have not used it before, it's just really fascinating, and it's free, and it's a great way of getting just very basic data about different countries. All right, exporting information on individual market data to identify the fastest growing markets, the largest markets for a particular product, and what are the market trends, right? What are the market restrictions? But importantly, consideration of governmental restriction. So, you're thinking exporting is a no-brainer. I want your stuff, you're exporting it, we're all happy. Remember that there are trade barriers that affect exporting, not just importing, but exporting, right? In this case, I use the example of the CHIP Act, right, which is computing and semiconductor manufacturing items. So in this particular case, the U.S. Department of Commerce has initiated, as of October of last year to 2022, new export control on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing items to the People's Republic of China. There's a lot of that going on right now with the CHIP Act. Hong Kong also having, Taiwan, the four tigers, right? So South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Everybody, to a certain extent, is kind of like in step with various export controls with their respective interpretation of their own CHIP Act. So now going international for, here's our old friend. This was not, this is something I added here we're talking about competitive assessment that matches the market with corporate strengths. It provides an analysis of the best market potential for specific product. So if you think about our old friend, the SWOT analysis, in this case, there's two. You're doing your own domestic SWOT, and in this case, you're trying to identify the opportunities for that foreign market. And what really you're hoping for is for your domestic market, when you have the right product, right, a particular specific product that's enabling you to take advantage of the opportunity. Remember, you have leverage, right? You're matching the strength to the opportunity. And in this case, if the market is similar enough, that product line might enable you to get a leverage point to that potential market's opportunity. So I hope that kind of makes sense, but your strength is your strengths, right? So in this case, if you've identified that potential market SWOT, then and it's aligned with your domestic SWOT, then you might have that green light on that. Of course, that's all part of your broad scope analysis for opportunities for exporting. So going international now, still we're going into importing. Firms shift their focus from supplying to sourcing. Importers need to be aware of the reliability of their foreign suppliers. Sometimes things happen. People maybe don't have a good reputation. They're flaky. They don't send what they said they're going to send. The consistency is a big deal. Remember that variation is the enemy of quality, right? When you think about quality, you need consistency. That's like one of the main tenets of quality. If you don't know what that means, think about where you get your coffee or your tea, and think about you really like it a particular way, and you go to this coffee shop, and what would it mean to you if, depending on who's behind the counter, if the person making your coffee cannot make consistently the same coffee, that would be an issue with quality and reliability. So consistency is always one of the aspects, a central aspect of quality. The length of delivery time as well. One of the reasons I was highlighting Panama in trade, international trade, we in California have lost some business because of the expansion of the Panama Canal, right? So now some Asian exporters have decided maybe it's cheaper for us to go through the Panama Canal and deliver our stuff on the east coast of the United States for that market, rather than go through the west coast, Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, and then rely on inland supply chains, trains, etc., which is going to add more cost, right? So what that meant to us here in California, Southern California, is we've lost some market share in distribution because of the beautiful, wonderful thing that Panama did by expanding its canal. If you haven't looked into it, I recommend you do. It's just phenomenal what is done there. So the government rules for the source country as well. Domestic restriction and legislation. So I have a picture here of the container, the China and US containers clashing. And they're all over the internet. The Economist magazine does a lot on that. And it's basically kind of showing, this kind of ensuing trade malaise, the trade war that's been going on, and various barriers being erected is going to affect, in this case, things being imported, as we saw firsthand also during the pandemic for different reasons. Risks of disruption and terrorism is another one. So East Africa has a lot of piracy, right? Actual real piracy, not electronic piracy. So that affects business, right? The disruption, the terrorism there. I know Somalia still has probably one of the predominant supply of piracy, and so through the Strait of Hormuz, when these ships get through, there's more and more talk maybe of even having these ships completely, fully automated, right? If you think about AI, and they're talking about how to combat terrorism and disruption in logistics, if there's nobody, controlling the ship except for a satellite, well, there's no way to take it over. Okay, let's see. A sequential process of researching foreign market potential. So you have your first stage, your preliminary screening for attractive course markets. Key questions here are: which foreign market warrant detailed investigation? Again, we kind of go back to what we talked about before, GDP growth, etc. We also look at the second stage here, assessment of industry market potential. The key question to be answered: what is the aggregate demand in each of the selected markets? And then once you've answered that, and you have a worthy answer of your effort, then you can go to stage 3, company sales potential analysis. How attractive is the potential demand for company product and services? Now it's more about what we're providing. And again, think about that SWOT analysis I gave you earlier, where we're trying to connect the dot between your internal product offering and the external opportunity in that market overseas. Market expansion. So now we're looking at obtaining detailed information for penetrating a market, designing and fine-tuning the marketing mix, and monitoring the political climate of a country. Things change, right? People come and go. There's an election going on right now in Turkey. So here we are. We're in April 2023, and it'll be really interesting when people watch this video in the future to see what's going to have happened. Tayyip Erdogan has been the leader of Turkey for 10 years, and now there's a coalition that's trying to compete with him. All these things really truly matter for business when central governments change. It doesn't mean you can't do business in Turkey, but you have to understand the current rules of the game. And as long as you're following the rules of the game the way they are and they work for you, then you can. But when the climate changes and changes maybe even drastically, then that's going to mean you have to reframe how you do business for your market expansion. And now we'll begin part 2. So for this part, we'll be looking at determining what the secondary information requirements are. And that's it for this part. So the first thing we look regarding secondary data for international marketing and where it can come from are several sources. In the United States, at the very least, and in developed countries where data is reliable from the government, in this case, I'm using the example of Europa, the European Union, for demographic information. And so that would be a really good source. In the US, it's the US Census. Again, a lot of very developed countries or even developing countries have pretty robust government data sets. Some countries, maybe for budgeting issues or other things, don't always have very reliable data. So you have to make sure that you're procuring your data. I know that in some less developed countries, sometimes you can get data from trade partners or from institutions that might have their own estimates of those countries' data. International organizations like World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the OECD, which is usually called a group of wealthy nations, have their own sets of data as well. The OECD has an incredible amount of information when it comes to economics data about countries and trade blocs, etc. Service organizations, accounting firms, law firms, airlines, trading firms, shipping, etc. They have a lot of their own publications. Trade associations, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce abroad collects a lot of data overseas as well. Directories, newsletters, they could be industry specific. So if you just basically think about even groups, organizations that have various sets of newsletters that way as well. Electronic information services, export.gov, again, export.gov has an incredible amount of resources just in terms of data sets that they collect, but also, as we know from other classes, it's where you would get, this is probably where you would start to figure out how to export to another country. And of course, data from other companies, maybe they'll publish. Publicly traded companies sometimes will publish data, and so you can take that and use that with a grain of salt. So now, determining the secondary information requirement, let's evaluate the data. So you have to, again, consider the quality of the data source with primary focus on the purpose and method of the original data collection. How was it done? Was it collected by the company? Did they go outside for it? So you want to make sure that you're using accurate data, so you need to consider these things. Then you assess the quality of actual data in terms of accuracy, reliability, recency, again, if it's too old, and you assess the comparability and compatibility of the data as well. There's this issue of parity that maybe if you have your own way of collecting data and interpreting data in the US, and you're getting data from a less developed countries, maybe that you're thinking about entering, there's going to be an issue of comparability and compatibility that you'll have to kind of neutralize. So how do you determine your secondary information requirement? So analyze and interpret secondary data requires a combination and cross-tabulation of various sets of data, the use of proxy information to arrive at a conclusion which addresses the research objective. And so again, what that requires you to do is to ensure that you're comparing an apple to an apple. So there's something called a proxy variable. It's a substitute for a variable that cannot be measured directly. And so here I'm using kind of this example. So China has a lot of automated ports. Hong Kong it's developed one. They're having some growing pains, but my understanding is like they're almost there. Taiwan, not Hong Kong. And so this is an example of the port of Nansha with the first fully automated container terminal. This was August 2022. And again, when we're talking about collecting data, maybe there's going to be some differences if you're trying to get shipping information for import-export and you're trying to understand what products are coming in. There's going to be productivity differentials when you're looking at a completely automated port and a port that's still running, the old-fashioned way. So again, things to consider. Determining secondary information requirement. So the data privacy is another big one. The international marketers must pay careful attention to the privacy laws in different countries, how you handle data. Same thing when you're doing a master's program or a doctoral program and you're going out there with your questionnaires, and if you're dealing with people, there are a lot of rules and laws in terms of how you handle sensitive information like that. Possible consumer reaction to the use of data in the marketing effort. So here's an example that I have. I mean, of course, the US, we get those alerts all the time, but I'm using the example here of a Nigerian bank under investigation over data breach. So it's so common. And so you really have to make sure that, especially when you're collecting data, you're super sensitive to that and you're taking all the right steps. Okay, now we're getting into part 3, and in this case, we're looking at the primary research process. So the primary research process is conducted to fill specific information needs. So we just finished the secondary, which again, the secondary is the smart way to start. It kind of sounds backward. You start with the secondary and then you go to your primary. So we've tried to not reinvent the wheel. We're trying to go out there and we're trying to use data that is going to help us kind of ascertain whether or not this market is the kind of market we can penetrate, how we go about it, blah, blah, blah. But now maybe we have a unique product. Maybe our product position, with our VRIO, it is so unique that we do have to ensure that we're going to meet certain criteria and the demand will be there. For that, we need to conduct our own research. We need to interview people. We need to make sure that the customers are there, that they have the means, etc. And so this is when we get into primary research, which is going to be typically a lot more costly, of course. So it is essential for the formulation of strategic marketing plans to go out and do that. And it's useful in international markets. And so here's an example of market sizing and forecast. So the Global Market Research Service, this is kind of give you an idea how big a market research is. So the Global Market Research Service increased $69 billion in 2016 and $76 billion in 2021. So it is incredible how big a market it is. And you'll see that the advertising firms in the world, the top 10 advertising firms, are not the same firms as the market research firms, right? And so you know, again, just to give you an idea how significant a market it is, and how also kind of going back to global business with what we call the make or buy decision, you can conduct your own research, or as we'll learn, you can go with a company that does that for a living. Let's see. And so the firms recognize that segmentation variables play a major role in identifying similar consumer groups in different countries. Now it's getting really, really interesting, right? So this is where you're going into this idea that maybe if there's significant markets that are the same, you find enough similarities with people that I don't need to tailor my campaign to each specific country, right? I can find similarities in people across different countries that's going to meet my requirement for my product. Determining information requirement, formulate specific research question to determine precise information on a subject. And industrial versus consumer research, very, very different right there, right? So you have the researcher selects either a consumer or industrial user for conducting research. So is it going to be your end user that's going to be the target for your product? Or in this case, are you targeting organizations, companies? Very, very different way of reaching and researching and marketing. So determining research administration approaches. You have the centralized version. In this case, it affords the most control to headquarters, right? Then we have research specification. Again, the focus, the thrust, and the design are directed by the home office, followed by forwarding to the local country operation for implementation. Historically, this is what we found out. If you look at a multinational corporation, and let's say you have, headquarters in New York, and this is going back to even the 80s and the 90s, and the very centralized structures typically make mistakes, right? If you think that you can have a bunch of MBAs in New York tell you what's going to be best for a market in Thailand, you are wrong. And so this is just kind of an aside to let you know that there's a problem. That, centralization can be great because running an organization when you're very centralized makes command and control efficient, effective, etc. But once you start to really consider the international field and different countries and different cultures and different ways of doing things and different tastes, then you realize that centralization can really, really backfire. And so it's going to be important for you to ensure and to ask yourself, in terms of the primary research process, is it better to initiate it in New York, or is it better to try to initiate locally in the area of the country you're trying to go for? Okay, so the coordinated is the second one. So this is an intermediary, such as an outside research agency that brings headquarters and country operations together. You have the decentralized, with corporate headquarters establishing the broad thrust of research, delegates design and implementation to the specific countries. Again, you kind of get the idea of how this is going to work. If you're outsourcing, that might be the best thing for you. Sometimes there's issues. If you're outsourcing, you have to really trust the company, because maybe you have some kind of a proprietary product that has not been released yet, and you have to keep everything under wraps, etc. So outside research services, the use of the research agencies are appropriate for large-scale international market research. Again, I just talked about that, when highly specialized research skills are required. I go back to the idea of core competency. If you're in the business of making cookies, and that's all that's what made you famous. You're a big cookie manufacturer, and your cookies are amazing, and you sell them all over the world, right? The question is, should you be in the business of market research internationally, right? Well, we already know that's not your core competency. But if there's one of 10 huge companies out there worth almost $1 trillion market between all three of them per year, maybe they know what they're doing, because that is their core competency, and it might be better for you to have them do it if you want to have something very reliable and accurate. So the selection process should emphasize the quality of information rather than the cost. I just said that. The primary, again, determining the research technique depends on different factors. There's the objectivity of the data that you're seeking, the prevailing conditions in the country and segments to be studied, whether the research is to collect as historical facts, or you're gathering information about future development. What does that mean? I don't know, this is a kind of soda that is new, and this is maybe that people have drank soda before, and you're trying to understand what the demand is for soda. What do they like about soda? When do they drink soda? In conjunction with what? Does the temperature affect things? Whatever. So that could be like a historical way. But if it's a new product that's never been out, if you're targeting a market that says never heard of soda, then it's going to be future, right? Cultural and individual preferences, of course, is going to be obviously one of the primary factors. So the primary research process, there's different types of research instruments. Just so you guys know, for this section, I'm kind of trying to keep it as mainstream as possible. So there is the option to kind of dig deeper into research methodology, research tools. For the purpose of this class, I'm going to not go fully operational in terms of research. There's a couple reasons. A lot of students have not taken stats yet, and typically once you start taking stats, we can really start looking into research methodology. And this is more of an exploratory class, right? We're not looking into the becoming technicians in terms of conducting research quite yet. And so the interview is a big one. The intent is to obtain in-depth information instead of a wide variety of like surface information. I'm sure you're all familiar with what a focus group. This could be what a focus group looks like. Sometimes there's a one-way mirror there, but a lot of times I'd say this is somebody kind of like, here it is, interaction within a group, ideally 7 to 10 participants about a specific group. I had a student who bought a Ford Mustang, brand new. This is several years ago. And he told me that Chevrolet somehow reached out to him about 6 months after he bought the Ford Mustang, and they wanted him to be in a focus group to see about consideration or the kind of people who have to choose between buying a Ford Mustang and a Chevrolet Camaro. And so, and it seems like from what he had told me that the focus group was composed of younger men, younger students, well, not students, all of them, but younger men who financially were in a position to have to make that decision between those two competing American brands. So that's an example of a focus group. Highly efficient in terms of rapid accumulation, accumulating a substantial amount of information. When we have our political cycle here in the US every 4 years, that's when focus groups become key. A lot, Republicans and Democrats in various states conduct hundreds and hundreds of focus groups because they're trying to understand the direction of the expectations or demands from the people in their party, how they're voting, what's important to them. Okay, so observations requires a researcher to play the role of a non-participating observer of an activity or a behavior. It can be personal or impersonal, obtrusive or inobtrusive. I remember when I was in college, I had a professor who had said at the time, this is back in the 90s, that the toy industry in the United States had broken records in a couple of years for how much money they were spending on research and development. And they, of course, it's imperative for them back then that they were keeping everything top secret, hush hush. They want to make sure that around the holiday season, end of the year, their toy is the big surprise, so that their competitors don't have time to try to copy or come with some comparable product. And the observation was a really big deal in that industry, especially when your target is a younger target, right? So if you're trying to target toddlers, and what you do, you pay the parents, and so these parents are coming in, dropping off the kids in this what looks like a ginormous playroom with all these toys on the ground. Of course, there's a couple of adults there, not the parents, or sometimes the parents, and there's a huge one-way mirror, and they're recording everything, and they're taking copious notes, and they're actually counting who's playing with what toy, how long they're holding it, are they fighting for it, etc. It was quite interesting to see, in this case, how observation is used in that industry. It can be extremely useful in shedding light on practice not previously encountered. The degree to which the observer has to be familiarized or introduced to other participants, it may vary. Again, I'll just give you an example. And the complexity of the task may differ due to the use of multiple languages. There's some countries where maybe you don't have a predominant language. There's some countries geographically where people might speak several languages. And now we're going into quantitative research techniques. So again, you have quantitative and you have qualitative. So quantitative is just survey, and when you're done, we're just tabulating the results and we get data, right? So you give out surveys, useful in providing the opportunity to quantify concepts. They're conducted usually with questionnaires that are administered personally, by mail, by telephone. If you ever go to a mall, there's these things called mall intercepts, where you might have someone hanging out with a clipboard or an iPad, and sometimes they're just asking you for your time and you get nothing. Sometimes you get a coupon, sometimes you get cash, and that's what they're doing. They're trying to understand with these surveys, what are you shopping for at the mall, how often you come, blah, blah, blah. It can be hampered by social and cultural constraints. What does that mean? Well, maybe you're in a country where culturally it's not okay for a man to approach a woman, right? Or maybe even a woman, approaching another woman. There's some questions that you cannot ask, right? You cannot ask, are you married? There's things you can or cannot do culturally, right? So there's going to be restrictions and limitations to what you can or cannot do there. Reasons why new product development information should not rely on consumer surveys. There we go. Absence of responsibility, could be conservative attitudes, vanity. What does that mean? Sometimes, I don't know. Of course, you're going to have a margin of error with your responses, but people might not be very forthcoming with giving you accuracy in how they're answering the questions for various reasons, right? Vanity, yes, of course I make $300,000 a year, so that they're going to check instead of telling you the truth that they're making $25,000 a year. Allows the researcher to rapidly accumulate a large quantity of data amenable to statistical analysis. Then we have these international comparative research that has been carried out between nations. If the environments are similar, that the impact of uncontrollable macro variables is limited. Let's see. So presenting the research results. So now that you have those results, the primary focus must be on communicating. It's kind of the notion of the difference between data and information, right? Your boss is only interested in information. Your boss wants a limited amount of data. So if you have like this survey report that's 150 pages, and you were thinking for a second that your boss is going to read all pages, as he or she is enjoying, drinking a scotch in front of the fireplace in the evening, you are grossly wrong. What they want typically is, a lot of times, in fact, they just want what's called an executive summary. Just give me 1 or 2 pages, tell me what's going on, what do I need to know, because they want to just turn that into action one way or another, right? You're the expert, that's why we hired you. I don't need to know how the sausage is made. So you want to present results clearly and concisely. Lengthy data and analytical demonstrations should be avoided. So I just said that. I know sometimes my students have a tendency, some groups have a tendency in my intro to business class, for some of you still remember if you've taken the class, there's this stock project, right? This group project where you're investing $100,000 in 5 companies, splitting 20K per company, and you're tracking the companies for a semester. And what I ask is, I want to see the activity of each stock for the semester, but I want to see that in a way that, of course, in a few seconds, gives me an idea what's going on. And so, of course, we use graphs, right? I usually require students to use Finance Yahoo, and through Finance Yahoo, they can create all kinds of graphs for the stocks. But occasionally, I'll have some students who give me spreadsheets. They give me pages and pages and pages of tables of spreadsheets with no graphs. And so that's an example of that. I can't visually quickly ascertain the trajectory of the stock, right? Did they have a big jump one time throughout the semester? Was it a series of small changes? Are there 3 or 4 critical things that happened during the semester? What were they? Was it competition? Or was it the economy? Was it law? Et cetera, et cetera. So again, that's the difference between data and information. And it's really important that you remember that when you're presenting something like that, you don't fall in love with the data. That's your thing maybe, but you want to make sure that you convert that to information, right? Availability of data and techniques used should be mentioned. So you do want to let them know at least about techniques, and because that might affect the results, right? Possibilities for analogous application should be highlighted as well. All right, let's see. Follow-up and review. Without proper follow-up, the role of research tends to become a mere staff function. And a lot of multinationals have been guilty of that, where they have a big budget and they do all this research and there's just no follow-up. So then the research just dies in research and they could miss out on some amazing opportunities, right? So you do want to make sure that you follow up. It is isolated from corporate line activity and lacks major impact on corporate line activity. So if you remember for your management class, line versus staff functions, right? And so in this particular case, that's the problem, right? The research tends to live in staff and line is on the other side, and then just, So you want to have a really good relationship with your institutional research department, right? However you're calling, your stats, your market research department, you want to have a really, really good relationship because that department might really kind of be, you know, they have the power to be able to convey to you an opportunity that you haven't thought about just based on what they're starting to see in trend lines with these activities. Well, that's it for us. I hope that you got a lot out of. Sorry, that's what you get to see. You get to see my screen saver here, my wallpaper. I hope you got a lot out of this. This is a very interesting chapter, and again, we're starting now to kind of chisel further at this how to have a presence with international marketing on a broad global scale. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you for the next chapter next time.